From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congress goes into its lame duck session with a full agenda as Democrats try to make hay with one more month of unified government. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. Job one for Congress as it enters this lame duck session, it seems, is passing a bill to impose a bargaining agreement on unionized railroad workers to avert a national rail strike. And if you want to know more about that, please listen to yesterday's Potomac Watch podcast. But then job two, perhaps, is funding the federal government. The current government spending deal expires on December 16th, and I don't think anybody wants a shutdown going into the holiday season, but it may be close. Senator Richard Shelby is saying that negotiations on an omnibus spending bill won't really begin seriously until next week, and, quote, "we might be here at Christmas. You know, there's a lot of things at stake," unquote. So, Kim, what are you hearing about where these negotiations are headed?
Well, first, it might be worthwhile reminding everybody what is supposed to be happening here. Under budget rules, what both chambers of Congress are supposed to do is, by the end of September, each pass 12 annual spending bills, which then get reconciled with each other and fund the government for the next year until the next September. Of course, Congress never does that anymore, and instead what they did is their usual kick of, at the end of September, they passed a continuing resolution to keep funding exactly where it is until a deadline now of December 16th, and now they're trying to, instead of passing the individual bills, wrap everything into one giant omnibus and then pass it and get out of town. The problem is no one has done any work on any of this so far, given the election. They're even more behind than they usually are. What Democrats are attempting to do is use this last big omnibus to get enormous, giant increases in domestic discretionary spending, which is always their priority. They're hoping to drag Republicans along by also offering a little bit more of an increase in military spending this year. And that's a decision facing everyone. Do they want to go down this road, or, as House Republicans seem to be preferring, pass another short-term CR until they officially take control next year, giving there some more leverage and influence over what these final spending bills look like?
But the third option is another long-term continuing resolution. And here we have a clip of Nancy Pelosi with an interjection from Chuck Schumer discussing how this might be the fallback position.
If we don't have an option, we may have to have a year-long CR. We don't prefer that. We don't think it's a good idea. But nonetheless, we have to have a bipartisan agreement as to what the top line is: defense, domestic, discretionary, non-defense spending. And that's what we have, I think, in good spirit, have said we'll go to the next step.
It was really a good spirit of all four of us trying to have a meeting of the minds that we could get enough votes to pass in both the House and the Senate.
And that is something that we would like to get to work on right away. Our appropriators have been working on it, and now we want to take it to the next step as soon as possible.
And here's the view from House Minority Leader Republican Kevin McCarthy.
Democrats control the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And we're sitting here talking about this. Maybe this is the reason why Republicans took the majority in the House. They didn't do their job. They controlled all government, and now we're sitting at the last moment in time debating whether to do a CR or not, that we know causes pain to the American public. It's because Congress was not working. Congress was not doing their job. But from saying all that, I'm not going to sit back and let some bill pass in the middle of the night. I'm not going to let them continue to do this runaway spending.
Kate, a year-long continuing resolution seems like it would be a double-edged sword, and some Republicans in the past support that kind of thing because it locks in previous spending levels. On the other hand, a year long is a long time for the defense budget to go, especially in an inflation situation we're in right now, without getting a bump up.
Yeah, Kyle, I think first we should dwell on just the total cynicism of the parity strategy. So Democrats demand here that every dollar that goes to the military is matched with a dollar that goes to domestic spending. Now, keep in mind that Congress has spent trillions of dollars on domestic priorities via COVID bills, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. There have been no shortages of opportunities for domestic spending, but the defense authorization and the appropriations process are the core opportunity for Congress to decide what the military will look like and what its spending priorities are. So I think it really should not be accepted just as a premise. Democrats are basically saying, well, you just have to give us $1 for every dollar we spend on defense. And I really think voters should take a closer look at that premise and understand what they're really arguing. To your question about continuing resolution, I think perhaps the best option in this bad set of options here would be a short-term continuing resolution that kicked it into the new year. That the Defense Department is accustomed to handling, and I don't think would be an enormous deal. I do think it's important to understand what a continuing resolution for a full year would mean for the Pentagon and why it's so damaging. I mean, to hold to your point about inflation, merely holding them at last year's levels amounts to a cut because inflation is so ferocious and it will really erode their purchasing power. But at the same time, continuing resolutions lock in last year's priorities. They slow down acquisition projects like the Air Force's B-21 bomber trying to replace its bomber fleet. They also have an enormous hit on operations accounts. The Navy is very, very far behind in repairing its submarines and carriers. And that is the kind of work that would slow down and eventually cause a readiness problem. So there is real damage to the Pentagon from year-long continuing resolutions. But at the same time here, I'm very sympathetic to Republican efforts here that they don't want to get taken hostage for large domestic spending increases, that once you pass those spending increases, Kyle, they get locked into Congress's budget baseline. And then if you try to merely go back to last year's spending levels, Democrats howl that you're cutting spending. So this is really a tough situation here. And I do think Republicans should try to hang on a little bit longer for a better deal than they're being offered.
I understand the argument from the Republican perspective for a short-term continuing resolution, basically kick this process to the next Congress. Then there'll be a transition of power in the House. Speaker Kevin McCarthy will be leading that side of the government. We'll have divided government, not unified democratic government. But Kim, do you think that that's an argument that resonates with enough Republicans in Congress right now in order to ensure that it happens? Or are there plenty of Republican appropriators who don't mind a big omnibus bill that spends some money? And remember, we have earmarks back in Congress.
Yeah, that's the problem. Democrats understand this well, as you could tell from that clip we ran from Nancy Pelosi. Their argument is we either do a great big omnibus or we're stuck with this long-term CR that will be bad for the military and all the things you want. Or if we really get in a jam, there'll be a government shutdown. They're playing to those Republican appropriators, giving them an out, as it were, because if you're Richard Shelby, who is the head of the Republican side on appropriations, you know darn well that there's another option, which is a short-term CR. But you're retiring this year, and you would really love to shower the streets of Alabama with earmark gold as your final swan song as you head out of the building. And there are a number of Republicans who are in that situation this year, longtime spenders who are about to retire. They're thrilled that the GOP and Democrats agreed to bring back earmarks. A funny little side note on this whole process, the negotiators have agreed to absolutely nothing so far except for one thing, which is everybody submitted their earmarks and everyone's earmarks have been signed off on. So that's the one thing that everyone has agreed on so far in this process. But in terms of top line amounts that are going to be spent on domestic or defense spending, in terms of the individual provisions, in terms of the policy writers that people always insert into these, none of that has been agreed to. And Democrats are, as it were, kind of giving a little aid and assist to Republican appropriators who would really like to have a little bit of momentum to have that final omnibus. Can I just point out one last thing here, too? That even with the huge numbers we're talking about, and our sources have told us that Democrats are asking for $150 billion more, roughly divided between domestic discretionary and defense spending. But that doesn't count the $9 billion that the White House is asking for additional COVID funds. It doesn't count the $38 billion that it's requested for additional Ukrainian aid. It doesn't include the annual tax extender dance that we have, in which everyone rushes to extend certain vital tax extensions for different business constituencies. So there's a lot more money in addition to that $150 billion.
One piece of these spending ambitions I wanted to pull out specifically is the child tax credit. And the Journal had an editorial this week. The headline is "The Parable of the Child Tax Credit," that I would commend to listeners. But Kate, what is the case against this plan to bump up the child tax credit again?
Well, Kyle, so as a lot of our listeners know, the child tax credit was temporarily boosted in 2021. And it was $3,000 for kids 6 and up and $3,600 for younger kids. And that's up from $2,000 before. Kyle, basically what this change did, more than just boosting the numbers, it made the entire credit what's called fully refundable. And that means it's available to people who don't pay any federal income taxes. So it's not really a tax credit at that point. It's a universal child allowance. And if you had 2 kids under 5, you're looking at over $7,000 of checks from the IRS. So the first issue, Kyle, is it's not really a tax credit. It's a welfare payment and part of the vast entitlement state. The second, I really think that deserves more attention is that it reduces the incentive to work and advance. The idea that people will work fewer hours if they are paid whether they work or not is something so obvious that you need a PhD in economics not to understand it. The child tax credit generally has required those who claim it to have some income, and it would get richer as you earned a little bit more. And the goal was to avoid punishing work. Democrats completely got rid of that and then basically made it just a complete straight handout. So I think it really undercuts work in ways that have been underappreciated. The third thing, Kyle, is that the left really likes to claim here that this is a magic subsidy that can really cut child poverty. But because of the issues with work that I was just describing, where you have parents either exit the labor force or cut back on their hours, those effects really swamp the cuts in poverty. And there have been a number of economists who have been trying to capture a better picture of what's really going on in households right now. Our poverty measures tend to rely on reports of income that don't capture government transfers, don't look at how people change their decisions. And for instance, there are better things to look at, like how much a household is able to consume, a consumption measure versus an income. So the child tax credit, despite these headlines that you see over and over again every day, that child poverty is dramatically reduced, those are based on data that are not really looking at what's going on inside a household. When you look at all of these factors I'm describing, you see a much murkier picture that shows child poverty hasn't moved much at all over the past year and a half, but it has gone down somewhat dramatically since the 1990s. So that's kind of the basic problems with a huge refundable child tax credit, as Democrats would like to pass in the lame duck. And there are others that it makes it harder to reform the tax code in productive ways.